whom we worked very closely on this report. Of course, the conclusions and the analysis are the responsibility of the authors in the Atlantic Council, but we really, I think, put a strong emphasis on being as inclusive as possible in this work and reaching out to partners to make it relevant. With this, thanks again for joining us, and now let me turn to Olivier Remibel, a visiting fellow from the French MOD at the Atlantic Council, who will kick us off in this conversation.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on what time zones you're in. I'm Olivier Remibel, visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council. We will now be talking briefly about the report with our two co-chairs, General Stéphane Abrial, Board Director of the Atlantic Council and former Supreme Allied Commander Transformation NATO, and Sir Peter Westmacott, Distinguished Ambassadorial Fellow at the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, former Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States, France, and Turkey. Long diplomatic experience that you recount in a book you have coming out soon. They call it Diplomacy. So Peter, may I start with you? In December, the United Kingdom and the European Union reached an agreement about their future cooperation, but where do we stand at the moment on security and defense and foreign policy? Is there anything in those agreements to frame that relationship?
Well, thank you, Olivier, and thank you everybody who's contributed to this exercise, and thank you to everyone who's dialed in from the outside to listen to our little launch event to explain what it's all about. I think most people are perhaps painfully aware that after 4.5 years of negotiations, the United Kingdom finally, formally, and more or less completely left the European Union at the end of December. It was a difficult, tortuous period of time during which I think a lot of the foreign and security interests of the United Kingdom and of Europe were kind of put to one side. It is the case that back in the original withdrawal agreement of December, the political declaration, I should say, of the end of 2019, there was some ambitious language that in the new relationship that was going to come into being between the United Kingdom and the European Union, that there would be understanding on foreign policy and defense cooperation. But that was taken off the table in the course of the negotiations during 2020, while the emphasis really was on trade and the other bits and pieces of the relationship. Britain was not going to be single market, not going to be customs union. There was supposed to be a seamless and frictionless free trade arrangement, and the results are there. It's a little bit tricky. There are still some problems going on as we speak, more or less now, as far as that trade agreement affects Northern Ireland. But there isn't anything structured or formal about foreign policy and defense because of that emphasis on other subjects. And I think because, to be honest, in the United Kingdom, where there were a lot of tricky political questions around sovereignty and whether we really were leaving or whether we weren't, people thought that this was perhaps a bridge too far at this point. Nevertheless, in the agreement that was reached last December, there is some language snappily called an agreement on security procedures for exchanging and protecting classified information. A bit of a mouthful, but it does nevertheless mean that we haven't forgotten completely about the way in which the security interests of the European Union and the United Kingdom remain common and shared and very important. And I think the other thing that I would just add is that despite the absence of foreign security policy in the agreement, it's perfectly clear that on a number of ad hoc foreign and security policy issues, that cooperation is continuing between the main European capitals. There's the P3, E3 as we used to call it, Paris, Berlin and London, which worked very effectively on the Iran nuclear deal almost 6 years ago. And there are other foreign policy issues which are still being given a kind of joint treatment by the principal European capitals. So that gives us some hope for the future. But what we don't have is any sort of a structured agreement. And what our paper here is intended to try to look at is where do we go from here? How do we build on what's still there? And how do we ensure that the common shared security and foreign policy interests of all European countries are something that we can look after sensibly and adequately in the years to come?
Many thanks, Sir Peter. That was very clear. And so to start teasing out what is in the paper, I will now turn to Jean Labrial. So what are the consequences of the fact that there isn't such an agreement? Is it actually an issue? Is it something we can live with? Can you comment on that, Mon Général?
Yes, thank you very much, Olivier. And please let me join my thanks to those which my friend Peter just expressed. Yes, it is an issue. It is an issue, the problem being that the consequences may not be keenly felt in the short term. So one could argue that the UK's contribution to CSDP at the time of Brexit was limited, or if I want to phrase it differently, but the UK was not using CSDP very much. And same goes for the industrial cooperation under the new EU tools. However, when assessing what would be lost, we should rather have a dynamic rather than static point of view, looking for missed common opportunities. For example, at the operational level, the EU will lose the ability to tap into the EU possibilities, into the UK's substantial capabilities. For example, the full spectrum expeditionary forces with key enablers such as heavy lift helicopters and air refueling aircraft. While the UK will no longer benefit from accessing EU instruments tailored to intervene on the southern flank, blending development assistance and military force. On the industrial side, there is a strong history of cross-channel integration. For example, projects like the Eurofighter, the Boxer vehicle, or the MBDA missiles, both UK and EU. But of course, looming in the background is the question of the future combat aircraft system on the one side, and the Tempest on the other side, the UK side, rejoining at some point.
No, many thanks. So, many thanks, Mon Général. And I will now turn back to Sir Peter. If we look at a more political and strategic levels, what would the implications be of the relationship as it stands now?
Well, I think the thing we have to remember is that for the United Kingdom and for the rest of the European Union, we're still going to be living in the same strategic environment. We're still going to have the same broad security concerns. We're still going to be worried about and looking at how we address issues like the destabilizing activities of Russia. What are we going to do about instability on the periphery of Europe? What about a more assertive China, which is challenging many of the rules of the international order? All those issues are still out there, not to speak of cybersecurity and the continuing threat of terrorism and the other issues which we all need to work on together. And all this at a time when the United States, under new leadership, of course, is nevertheless going to be affected by a lot of the cultural change, if I can put it like that, that's taken place over the last few years. As Americans have begun to say to themselves, why are we the world's policemen? Why are we involved in faraway wars costing a lot of blood and treasure? Why are we shouldering a disproportionate element of the security burden of free countries where they're a long way away from us and we're paying more than we should be and they're not doing enough? All that is an old debate. It came up strongly during the Trump administration, but it's not going to go away simply because there is now President Biden. And we've got a lot of people of great talent, great experience who are now part of that team, who were also part of that debate at the time of President Obama. So that's the background against which we Europeans have got to, if you like, get our act together. And I think it would be a great shame if through lack of adequate cooperation and looking at ways in which we work together, we find that we begin to diverge not only on strategy and our concerns, but also on our ability to stand together and address those worries.
Many thanks, Sir Peter. And indeed, so now we have, I think, a better view of where we stand currently and what the state of play is in the EU-UK relationship. So, as Ben said, it's maybe now time to put Brexit behind us and turn toward the future. Where do we go from there? How do we start to tie or retie the knots and rebuild a relationship? And I will now turn to Sir Peter, to Mon Général Abrial. What are your suggestions there?
Well, I think we definitely need to find ways to maintain a deep relationship between the UK and Europe, which is as necessary as ever. So we thought that there are three scenarios possible. One, a comprehensive agreement, unlikely in the current atmosphere. Two, making full use of existing possibilities, like the framework participation agreement for CSDP operations, or administrative arrangement with the European Defence Agency, etc. And three, eschewing formal agreements and relying instead on ad hoc consultation and cooperation, depending on the issue at hand. with ties maintained through NATO, as well as minilateral formats such as the E3 or the European Intervention Initiative. Closer relationship can be sustained and rebuilt by being pragmatic and making full use of institutional and non-institutional formats. In concrete terms, this means creating practical instances of cooperation. I send you back to scenarios 2 and 3 to help build trust and work as building blocks for a denser relationship in the future. For more details, I will encourage you to look into the report. This should be accompanied by measures that ensure familiarity and trust among policymakers, such as maintaining personal contacts and strategic understanding through Track 1.5 dialogues, the European Intervention Initiative, and a deepened NATO-EU cooperation. Again, more details to be seen in the report. Finally, at the political level, the UK and the EU's narratives can actually meet. The global Britain and strategic autonomy agendas, as they get fully explored, need not be at odds. Both speak to the need for democracies in the transatlantic family to tackle the challenges, military, economic, technological, that lie ahead. And all these ideas can help maintain this close relationship we advocate.
Thank you, Mon Général. And as you said, and for our viewers, there is so much we can say in a short video, so please do read the report. And I know some of you may be wondering, why is an American think tank weigh in on a European issue? And that's because there is also a transatlantic dimension to this debate. So I'll turn now to Sir Peter, and especially based on your experience here as an ambassador in Washington, why does this matter for the US? And what can the Biden administration do?
Well, Olivier, as you just said now, I think it's important to remember that the Atlantic Council, it may be US-based, but there is General Abrial, there is me, there are plenty of other people from the European side of the ocean who are part of your work and part of your initiatives, and we're very pleased to be a part of that. It is, after all, the Atlantic Council, it's not just the American Council, and I think that's part of its strength, if I may say so. So yes, obviously, it is in the United States' interest that the European side of the ocean is secure, works together, pulls its weight, and is capable of standing up to malevolent influences and risks to security. It is not in America's interests for Europeans to fall out. And so just as I would say much of Washington, and this is a largely bipartisan issue, had deep doubts about Brexit as to whether this was going to see the United Kingdom leaving Europe and weakening Europe as part of that process. So I think the United States has an interest in Europe remaining strong in these areas of security, because it is also in America's interest that Europe is capable of defending itself and being together useful allies of the United States, because we do share many of the same interests, many of the same values, and we have to stand up to the same threats. We have a very, very similar threat and assessment to our friends in Washington. Now, the new administration has clearly signaled that it's moving on from the more unilateralist approach that we've had of recent years, that it wants to go back to the days of Washington working with allies, consulting with allies, working alongside them, seeing how we can collectively address issues. And generally speaking, I think if we do it together, it's more effective than any one country trying to do it all by itself. And I believe that is the instinct of the new administration. And as President Biden said in his visit to State Department, America is back. And a strong speech from Secretary Blinken in his early remarks, reasserting, if you like, the principles of US foreign and security policy, much of which would have been music to the ears of America's allies in the European Union. So I think given that background, it is very much in America's interest that we should find ways of ensuring that the transatlantic, and by extension, the cross-channel, and by extension, the transatlantic defense and security and foreign policy relationship remains as strong as it possibly can be, notwithstanding the decision of a majority of those who voted in the referendum 5 years ago to take the United Kingdom out of the European Union.
Many thanks, Sir Peter, Mon Général, for this discussion about the report. Again, to our viewers, please read the report, but also engage with it. Ping us back at the Atlantic Council. We'd be happy to hear your thoughts. We'll now be turning to Minister Loiseau and Lord Sedwill for a conversation about the future of EU-UK relationship. I mean, Benjamin introduced them, but Minister Loiseau is the chair of the subcommittee on security and defense at the European Parliament, and therefore quite vested in the issue. She was also previously French Minister for European Affairs. Lord Sedwill is currently the chair of the Atlantic Future Forum and the chair of the G7 panel on global economic resilience, and he's a former cabinet secretary and UK national security advisor. So if I may now turn to both of you for initial remarks. To our viewers, we will be later taking on questions from the audience, which you can ask through the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. So Minister Loiseau, could I ask you first to give us a couple of words on where you think the UK-EU relationship stands and where we will be going forward in the future?
Well, thank you, Olivier, and thank you for having me today on a topic that I'm very much focusing on, have been focusing on Brexit for quite a while. And Brexit is a very long story of many regrets, among which the absence of an agreement on foreign policy and defense is one of them. But if you look at the photo of CFSP, CSDP, you might think that the UK had little to lose leaving the European Union without a formal agreement. A very light commitment of the UK in CSDP missions, even if it was appreciated. It was minimal, very little interest, if not some reluctance to see more efforts in terms of European defense, and many bilateral agreements or traditions between France and the UK in defense, the presence of British equipment or troops in Barkhane is, for instance, a very important thing for France. Relations within NATO, we are together in the Baltic states, relations within coalitions like in Iraq against Daesh. It could make for this informal sort of relation that the UK has advocated for, because there is no doubt that we don't have an agreement on foreign policy and defense because the British government had said it was not interested. On the EU side, we were interested. On foreign policy, you could also say that the European foreign policy is still a baby with a lot of difficulties. The rule of unanimity, which triggers decisions in foreign policy in the European Union, provides for the most reluctant and the less enthusiastic of all member states to decide the breadth and depth and the rhythm of European foreign policy. And the number of examples where we have been disappointing is quite long. At the same time, the UK belongs to E3. The UK is a permanent member of the Security Council. So you could still consider that now the UK has been more resolved, determined to react to China's behaviors, for instance, that the EU was. But if we don't look at the photo and if we look at the movie, at what we are building on the European side and what the UK will do in the future, I'm really concerned that informal relations will not be enough. Because for the moment, in the EU, we are making progress on defense. European Defense Fund means that there is European budget money in order to go against or loopholes, to save money, to be more efficient, and to go against the divides of our industry in terms of defense. Permanent structured cooperation means that we focus on our needs, be them operational or capacities, and will fill the gaps as well, more and more together in full compatibility with NATO, but with a European flavor, if I might say so. And we are currently working on what we call our strategic compass. And this is basically how we see the world, where are the threats, where are our priorities and what to do about it. And I cannot imagine that we are doing it the way we are doing it today without sharing our views with the UK. The UK is completing its own process of strategic review, and for the first time, we are not having a conversation about threats which we know are common and about how to deal with the threats together. And this is absurd. Of course, you could consider that NATO will make it, that our conversations in NATO will provide for anything that we need to do together. But I am not certain about it. NATO is a military alliance, and even if it has made a lot of progress enlarging its views and looking forward to the future, there are things that the EU can do that a military alliance cannot do. When we talk about space, outer space, access to space is a European asset. And we have to work on surveillance. We have to work on debris. We have to continue working with Galileo and Copernicus, which are very strong European programs. On cyber, there are things that are being done in NATO and are being done in the EU. When we deal about 5G, we have instruments at the EU level which do not belong to a military alliance. So no, NATO is not the only way to deal with these problems. And let me say that within NATO, you have a very disruptive member with Turkey. And if we consider that NATO is not only putting troops together, and the more the better, but also having common values and making sure that we don't weaken the interests of members of the alliance. So the list of question marks as regard Turkey is very long. And if I would sum up, I would say that in foreign policy, in the European Union, we would need more UK to trigger a more determined attitude vis-à-vis China. But vice versa, I think that for many months, for many reasons, the UK has turned a blind eye about what Turkey was doing. The UK was silent in NATO, even if what's at stake is really a game changer and not in the right direction. And just to finish my introductory remark, I would say that people are important. Informal relations, yes, we can try to continue talking one with another. We do it all the time, but we do it out of goodwill. And the European Union was built precisely to make sure that formal meetings, I would say processes, procedures, would force France and Germany to work together after 2 world wars, would help Eastern European countries to meet with Western European countries and build something together. So really, I like being pragmatic. I'm not a fan of formal formats, but I do think that in the future, when the atmospherics in London will have changed a little bit, we have to work on more formal agreements.
Many thanks, Minister Loiseau. And I take away from your introductory remarks the idea that we should be looking at the movie rather than at the photo of where we stand at the moment. Could I turn now to Lord Sedwill to also give us his opinion and his views on where we stand on EU-UK foreign policy and defense cooperation?
Well, Olivier, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this event. And may I say, I think it's a really good report. I welcome it. I think the recommendation of starting out between these options 2 and 3, as we heard from your 2 co-chairs, is the right one. And I also agree with much, indeed most of what Nathalie Loiseau has just said. I think we do need to remember that we face the same security threats within the continent and indeed within the Euro-Atlantic area. Russia now tackling us across a full spectrum of pressure, not just military pressure, but cyber, seeking to undermine our democratic systems and so on. And essentially national security now, partly because of that, needs to encompass a much wider range of considerations than was the case in the past. If national security 1.0 was essentially the defense of the realm, and 2.0 added to that dealing with terrorism and crime and other non-state threats, then national security 3.0 has to encompass economic security, environmental security, and indeed democratic security, because those systems are under threat from our adversaries as well. And to pick up Nathalie Loiseau's point, that means that we have to use all of the toolboxes available to us. The national toolboxes, the EU toolbox for the members of the EU, and the NATO toolbox. It can't simply be military. We need to use the full range of capabilities. And as you may know, when I was National Security Advisor, we developed in the UK a concept called the fusion doctrine, which was essentially how do we organize ourselves to bring all of our national capabilities together to deal with the wide range of security threats that we face across that spectrum that I just described. Second, it's just worth keeping in mind in the relationship between the EU and NATO, and that is a really important part of the institutional relationship within this continent, that the 21 EU members who are also members of NATO account for well over 90% of the EU's defence capability. Now that defence and that proportion would increase still further if all of those members met, as they're committed to, the 2% of GDP target that NATO has set. That's going to require significant uplifts in defence, but that would certainly mean that those countries accounted for even more of the EU's defence capability, and it accounts for around 2/3 of the European contribution to NATO. Traditionally, partly for the reasons that the previous speakers have set out, the UK has been somewhat reserved about defence integration within the EU, certainly capabilities and so on, and somewhat arm's length with CFSP and CSDP for reasons we all understand. Now that the UK is outside the EU, and given the changing nature of the threats and the fact that in particular we face these multifaceted threats, Russia across the full spectrum, instability to Europe, South and East, and of course we've got to deal with China, which is, as Jens Stoltenberg put it, while NATO might not be in China's hemisphere, China's very definitely in ours. It is actually now, in my judgment, in the UK's interest to encourage greater defence integration, greater defence cooperation, greater streamlining of EU defence capability, so that in effect, the bang for buck, the teeth-tail ratio among those 21 EU members who are also members of NATO becomes more effective and a more effective capability. The IISS, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which looks at this kind of issue very carefully and has worked closely with the Atlantic Council in the past, has done some work on this over the past couple of years and suggested that that if those European nations raise their defence budgets and invested in more integrated capability, then that would essentially address this burden sharing question that Peter Westmacott raised right at the beginning of this session, and would overmatch Russian conventional capability and indeed enable us to deal with some of the other threats to Europe's south and east. And I think that's behind a lot of what President Macron has said when he's talked about strategic autonomy and talked about the need for there to be greater coherence and investment through the EU in defence as well. But as Nathalie Loiseau says, it isn't just about military capability. In the modern era, we have to be able to assemble all of the capabilities of the states and in the members' case of the EU in order to both protect our security and promote our values worldwide. And I think that's going to be the agenda. So in the future. And so while the institutional arrangements between the UK and the EU are important, and as she said, it is a movie, not a photograph, the institutional arrangements between NATO and the EU are even more important. And even more important than any institutional arrangement is what sits underneath it. And that's investment in capability and ensuring that capability is truly integrated, truly effective, truly ready to be deployed. We've seen that at the national level. The UK, France, and the US dealt with the Syrian chemical weapons attacks as a group. The UK and France worked together in the Sahel. Many European nations deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And we did that, some of us under the NATO umbrella, but also through coalitions of the willing in some of those cases. And so I think we can mix and match the institutional arrangements. I agree that we need to strengthen the cooperation, and that point that Peter Westcott made about being able to exchange intelligence is critically important. But fundamentally, what we mustn't do is allow discussions about institutional arrangements to obscure the key issue, which is capability. And are we in this hemisphere, in this continent, the democratic nations of Western Europe, ensuring that together we have the capabilities to deal with the threats and advance our values that we need in this era. And I hope we can move the conversation onto that.
Many thanks, Lord Sidwell. I mean, I take away from your words the importance for Europeans to step up and to really invest in their capabilities, in their defense capabilities, but also since security has a broader definition now in all range of capabilities, and on this there will be room for the UK and the EU to work together. To kick off the conversation, could I first invite you, Minister Loiseau, Lord Sidwell, to react to both of your initial statements? I have a couple of questions myself, and then for our viewers, please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Minister Loiseau.
Well, I'm very comfortable with what Mark Sidwell said about the necessity to improve capability, to improve efforts in defense spending. The only word I'm not comfortable with at all, although it has become conventional wisdom, is burden sharing. Who is a burden for whom? Strategic autonomy is definitely not turning our back away from the United States. We were more fearful that the United States at some point would turn its back and be more interested in the Asia-Pacific challenges than in Europe. But it's not a question of a burden, it's a question of a shared responsibility and reciprocal relevance, I would say. We have to be more relevant in the transatlantic partnership. For that to be more credible, we have to spend more money, we have to have stronger capabilities, and we should not keep on whining when the US do something or when the US doesn't do something. There are things that we can do together, and there are things that are our priorities because they are our geography, they are our immediate interests, and the US may or may not be interested. And let's remember that last year, the results of the election were depending on the votes of not that many people throughout the country, and that it would have made a difference. So strategic autonomy is to be a stronger European partner of the United States, and with the UK, there has to be something. So far, the UK was the necessary ally of the US to understand what was taking place in the EU. It remains a favorite ally of the US, but it will not provide this opportunity to understand what's taking place in the EU. And on capabilities and on defense spending, efforts were made, progress was made until the pandemic struck us. And I'm very much concerned because, as we remember, in 2008, the financial crisis had this immediate consequence that defense spending started to get lower. And with the pandemic, we have to convince our fellow citizens that defense remains a priority. We do it the next European Council late in February will focus on two things: health and defense, which was quite bold. I discussed it with Charles Michel, the president of the European Council. I told him, Charles, really, congrats for putting it on the agenda. I said, well, if I had done a poll among fellow citizens, they would probably have thought that I am nuts to focus on defense right now. And this is the reason why it's so helpful to have a European defense fund at a moment where member states might be more reluctant to put the money where their mouth is. So, but once again, we are working on the European Defense Fund. We are working on bilateral or trilateral efforts like the common air system with Germany and Spain. And I still regret that we are not able to have more robust and more systematic cooperations with the UK, because I think that at some point we might fight either redundancies or difficulties to work together, and we do have to avoid it.
Lord Sedwell, if I may now turn to you.
Well, I'm afraid I'm disappointing you, Olivier, because I'm largely agreeing with Nathalie Loiseau, and I suspect you chose the two of us because you thought that a former French Europe minister, a former British national security advisor, might engage in more dialectic than perhaps we have. I think this key point that I made earlier, and it's just been reinforced by what Nathalie Loiseau just said, that when the UK was within the EU, then because of the politics of pooled sovereignty and so on, we were reluctant to see greater defence integration through the EU mechanism in particular. And we were concerned about the degree to which that could cause some kind of competitive arrangement, competitive institutional arrangements with NATO. Now, it shouldn't be beyond our wits to figure that out. And this report has shown how we can work out pragmatically a route to the UK and the EU's cooperation in defence and foreign policy and security and so on. And there's a parallel effort, which is arguably even more important, about the EU and NATO, particularly bringing those two differing but complementary toolboxes together, as Nathalie Loiseau was suggesting earlier. My own view is that now, given that the UK is now outside the EU and all of those concerns about sovereignty are quite clearly resolved, that it is now in the UK's interest to see the EU integrate defence and security capability much more effectively. And that isn't just defence. I'm actually pleased to see as well, like Nathalie, that defence is on the agenda of the European Council. It's true of domestic security as well. Schengen should be a single, effective, properly secured border zone. It isn't. It's essentially a mutual recognition arrangement within the EU, and there are some pretty weak links in that mutual recognition arrangement. It is in the UK's interest to see that as effective as a national border and as effective as the most secure national borders within our continental neighbourhood. So the same applies whether one is looking at homeland security, as the Americans call it, domestic security, internal security, or whether one is looking at defence. And I think gradually in the UK we will find that as we establish a new relationship with the EU as partners and allies, etc., rather than this integrated relationship we had before, that those in the EU arguing for greater integration of defence, greater integration of domestic security, will find that there's a voice just across the channel arguing for exactly the same. Because if we want to deal with the major security threats we face in this continent, then it is quite clear that in the end, more effective, more integrated capability and more investment in capability that certainly outweighs any concerns we have around the institutional arrangements. So the third set of institutional arrangements that need to be improved are the institutional arrangements within the EU itself to ensure that those capabilities can be developed. And Josep Borrell talked about this not long ago. I think he said the Americans have 4 warships and 1 main battle tank, and EU member states have 30 warships and 16 main battle tanks. Now, the academics argue about whether he's comparing apples with pears, but he's making fundamentally the right point. And therefore, I think there are three sets of institutional arrangements that we need to be looking at in this continent. Those within the EU, where I think we want to see, I certainly believe there should be more integration. Those between the EU and NATO, where we need to ensure both sets of toolboxes can be used in a complementary way. And the relationship within that umbrella of the UK and the EU is, of course, important too.
Many thanks. And I mean, to your comments, I must say I'm not disappointed that there is agreement between the two of you, because to some extent, the aim of that report is also to advocate for a close relationship between the UK and the EU. And I must say the UK, the EU, and the US as well, which is an important, it's a transatlantic family altogether. But maybe we might get into disagreements we might get into disagreements as we start diving into the more specifics. And maybe I'll abuse my power as a moderator to ask the first questions, but please join us in asking questions through the Q&A panel. I see quite a few coming in already, but please do so. And my first question to both of you is, how do you see the path towards rebuilding that in terms of political narrative and atmospherics? And especially, there is already some friction regarding the trade and the economic side. Will that spill over into security and defense? Or put it differently, how do we ensure that we do rebuild that relationship in security, defense, and foreign policy, and create a narrative and make that narrative heard, both in the EU, in the UK, but also here in the US? So could I turn again to Minister Loiseau and Marc Sedwill afterwards?
Well, this is the moment of truth. This is the moment where you have to say what's taking place and the atmospherics of the end of the negotiation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and what's taking place afterwards. And things have not been easy, and they are not easy right now. It's not such a surprise, it's a disappointment, but it should not be a surprise. When a leader came to power against the European Union, it takes time to calm down and say, well, it's a partner and we want it stronger. So far, the EU remains the favorite punching bag of the UK government on absolutely everything that takes place. Vaccines rollout is supposed to be faster because of Brexit. No, it is faster because of British talent. And this has nothing to do with being inside or outside of the EU. A very unfortunate blunder committed by the European Commission on the very touchy issue of Northern Ireland was unfortunate. It lasted 3 hours until Ursula von der Leyen decided that she was making a U-turn, and she called the Irish Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, and said, well, no, I'm changing my mind. It has been played out in London like a Shakespearean tragedy. Whereas for weeks we had very unpleasant threats coming from the British government, plainly saying we signed the withdrawal agreement, but we are not going to respect it, which was of course putting at risk the reputation of the UK. So this is where we are. We are trying to get out of this hole. On Brexit, there is a sentence that you will hear in each and every conference: it takes two to tango. You have to have the same incentives on both sides to show that we are friends after all. It has not come completely yet on the other side of the channel. I hope there will be goodwill. Just before being in this panel, I was talking with the Vice President of the Commission, Maros Šefčovič, was just back from London. And he was there to ease tensions and to say, well, let's cool down. If we have difficulties, let's look at what's taking place. So far, it looks as if we are blamed in the EU for the consequences of a decision we had not taken. Well, Brexit means Brexit, and trade is not frictionless, and things are more difficult, even if we have done everything we could in the trade and cooperation agreement. So it's a question of blame game. It's a problem of taking responsibility for the consequences of the decision. To make it short, it doesn't create the most appropriate condition to get back to the table and say, well, after all, we all know that we didn't discuss foreign policy and defense. Why don't we try now? I think this is the moment for informal discussions and creative formats and everything of this sort. But once again, let us not imagine that it will be enough, or let us not imagine that it is in our interest. I'm really 100% certain that the ones who are enjoying what's taking place are in Moscow and in Beijing and nowhere else.
Thank you. Can I turn to you now, Lord Sedgwick, please?
Thank you. Well, let me pick up that final point that Nathalie Loiseau made, because I think that is critically important, and it goes beyond the relationship between the UK and the EU, or indeed relationships within the European continent, because we've seen over the past 4 years how frictions within the Western community, within the democratic community, many of them transatlantic, where, you know, despite our arguments, we didn't start using national security provisions in our trade legislation against each other, but that did happen to both of us from the other side of the Atlantic, with Mercedes cars being regarded as a national security threat and therefore having punitive tariffs put onto them, and the UK and the EU suffering tariffs over steel, which was supposedly aimed at China for steel dumping. And that last point Nathalie Loiseau made is absolutely right. That if the West as a whole, if we're frankly squabbling among ourselves, then the beneficiaries sit in Moscow and Beijing and indeed other autocratic states. And therefore, if there is one thing that I hope we can really do now that we have Brexit accomplished and with the Biden administration in place, is restore that sense, that common sense of purpose in the Western alliance as a whole, not just between the UK and the EU, and to remember that however intense our squabbles, they are arguments within the family. And family arguments are often really bitter. I mean, we know that, but they are arguments within the family, and fundamentally our interests are, and indeed our values, are aligned. And we need to remember there's a big bad world out there, and we should try and stand together. There of course remain frictions over Brexit, and I'm not going to. You'll understand. Actually, the recent events is one where I would have a slightly different perspective to Nathalie Loiseau on where some of the political responsibility lies. The trade and cooperation agreement was fundamentally limited to trade. The city and financial services were left out, and as you'll know, there's been significant concern about equivalence and so on there. So even in the economic sphere, it isn't yet comprehensive, and there's a very big area that needs to be addressed, and we're going to have to see whether that can be addressed in a way that is win-win rather than zero-sum. There has certainly have been issues over trade frictions in Northern Ireland and vaccines and so on that have meant in this first few months since the agreement came into force at the end of last year, that there are genuinely teething troubles and frictions between us, and we need to work through those and remember that in the end our interests are fundamentally aligned, and that will require a bit of give and take and some goodwill on both sides, including on issues where we may conclude that in a pure negotiation we have equity that we want to hold on to. Sometimes you have to concede a bit of that in order to enable a negotiation to go ahead. I think, to to be candid though, that actually so far I've seen no real sign of those frictions on the economic side, and to some extent politically, certainly in health and so on, spilling into foreign policy and security. The British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, speaks often about the E3. Both Peter Westmacott and General Abriel mentioned that earlier. And beyond the traditional dossiers that the E3 has tended to address, Iran most notably, it's a group that very naturally functions together. It's almost the first call that a British Foreign Secretary makes. Certainly this Foreign Secretary has been making in the past year or so, right the way through all the Brexit frictions, even when the negotiations were still ongoing, to deal with some of the broader issues around the world. So I don't yet see a spillover of any of those frictions into foreign and security policy. And obviously we should aim to avoid it. But in any event, those frictions themselves, we want to try and resolve and settle our relationship. And remember that in the end, as I said, while the disagreements can be intense, they are disagreements within the family of European Western nations, and our interests are fundamentally aligned. And with the new administration in Washington, keen to advance an alliance of democracies, starting with the transatlantic relationship, recommitting to that, it's really important that in Europe we pick up that challenge and opportunity and show that we're ready to lead that effort as well.
Thank you very much, and I think you're entirely right in highlighting the transatlantic dimension also of that discussion, and how much a positive outlook from a Biden administration could also help build the ties between the UK and the EU. I noted in both of you a focus also on the fact that we are part of the same family, and it is only our adversaries that benefit from our disunity. And this actually dovetails nicely with quite a couple of questions we have about from Patrick Chevalreau, Mark Zashkin, or Mehmet Kinashi, for instance, about the risk of divergence or convergence on China and Russia. We only have 3 minutes left, so could I ask you in 5 words each to give our viewers as well, your opinions about, is there a risk of divergence on China and Russia between the UK and the EU? Yes or no?
Wow, that's challenging. I remember vividly, because I was a member of the French government when there was this Salisbury attack in the UK, how much solidarity was expressed by the EU, and efficient solidarity. The Russian diplomats were expelled, and for a chess player like Vladimir Putin, it was a clear signal that, all right, they don't like it, so I will stop it here. I hope that we are able to realize that, for instance, when BBC is in trouble in Beijing, it's not only a British problem, but it's more a free words problem per se. But this is not that easy. We have to find ways to invite Dominic Raab to Foreign Affairs Council and discuss this sort of things. We have to build bridges because, you know, our plates are all busy. And extra busy at the time, and still the risk that we talk only once in a while and don't realize that the threats are the same and that we should team up together is still very high. We've done our best on justice and home affairs, and now the UK has probably a status which equals or almost equals the status of a member state. But for foreign policy and for such huge challenges like Russia and China, I think we have to struggle to do more.
Lord Sedwell.
Thank you. Well, very briefly, I think there is a greater diversity of views within the EU on both Russia and China than there is between the centre of gravity of the EU and the UK, or if you like, certainly the more hawkish security end of the EU debate in the UK. If you look at the disagreements within the EU over Russia, including, as Nathalie Loiseau said, even over Salisbury, where we had admirable solidarity, but she knows that 1 or 2 member states took quite a lot of persuasion then, and we see the same in relations with China. I don't think actually the issue is between the UK and the EU. I think it's a rather artificial way of looking at it. That actually the UK stands in exactly the same place as many EU nations on both of those issues. I also agree with a final point that we need to make sure whatever the institutional arrangements, formal or informal, structured or unstructured, the dialogue about these issues is both regular and rich, because it's in that we will see the practical alignment of policy, which is actually how we'll respond to the challenges that we all face in this continent.
Many thanks, and many thanks to all of you for participating in this conversation. So if you want to find out more about ideas and proposals to build that dialogue, please look at our report on the Atlantic Council website. Thank you very much.